Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for participating in what promises to be a fascinating discussion on Sino-US relations. First, Dean Sfakianakis wants to address our group. So Dean Sfakianakis, the floor is yours.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
Thank you very much, dear guest speakers, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen. Let me thank you warmly for your presence in today's event organized by the Department of International and European Studies of the University of Piraeus at the Council for International Relations, Greece. As the Dean of the School of Economics, Business and International Studies, I would like to praise the role of the International and the European Studies Department and its faculty for the very substantial, simultaneously timely and contemporary events aimed at the production and dissemination of scientific knowledge they organize. Events contributing to a deeper understanding of some of the paramount issues of our time. Guided by excellence in teaching and research, our university substantially contributes to the organization and dispersion of knowledge. We aspire to the creation of a new generation of professionals and academics who will pursue success and excellence, a new generation of leaders both willing and able to adapt to the new dynamic environment, able to face every difficulty as a new challenge. The Sino-US relations constitutes a dynamic, tumultuous environment par excellence, where the Thucydides trap is even looming, and every new difficulty needs to be managed for it to be transformed into an opportunity. The evolution of Sino-US relations after the US presidential election is a crucial issue for international politics, impacting the economy and society not only in the United States and China, but across the globe. I conclude my salutation and let our speakers take the floor with my expectation for a most extremely interesting set of presentations. Thank you very much.
Dean Sfakianakis, thank you very much. I have to say that you're always supportive of all our endeavors, all our efforts, and this is something that's been going on for years. So we are very, very grateful to you, and thank you for making time to address our webinar.
Thank you very much.
The floor now goes to Professor Vasilis Trigas, who is actually will have the honor to introduce our truly distinguished speakers today.
Well, let me start by thanking you, Aristotle, and the Department of International and European Studies at Piraeus University for hosting this. Dean Sfakianakis and also the chair of the department, Professor Athanasios Platias, for the exquisite hospitality. I have to say I'm very privileged to be here. These are two towering intellectuals, Professor Andrew Nathan and Professor Qingming Zhang. And so they certainly need no introduction, but webinars have rituals. And so I'm just gonna read a short bio for both. So let's start with Professor Nathan, who is class of 1919 professor of political science at Columbia University. He is engaged in long-term research and writing on Chinese foreign policy and on the sources of political legitimacy in Asia. Professor Nathan served as chair of the Department of Political Science at Columbia University, chair of the Executive Committee of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and director of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, which I believe is the oldest East Asian Studies Institute in the United States. Professor Nathan's book include Peking Politics, Chinese Democracy, China's Search for Security, Negotiating Culture and Human Rights Beyond Universalism and Relativism, and How East Asians View Democracy. His article on resilient authoritarianism has become core curriculum across the world in China studies programs. So Professor Nathan is a PhD in political science from Harvard University. So welcome, Professor Nathan. And Professor Zhang Qingmin, who is a chair of the Department of Diplomacy at the School of International Studies, Peking University. His teaching and research interests include Chinese foreign policy, diplomatic studies, and China and East Asia. He is author of China's Foreign Relations, U.S. Arms Sales Policy Towards Taiwan, Contemporary China's Diplomacy, and more than 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. Professor Zhang has been a senior Fulbright scholar at George Washington Elliott School of International Affairs and a visiting professor at the Faculty of Law, University of Tokyo. Now, before joining Peking University, Professor Zhang taught at China Foreign Affairs University and directed training programs for junior and senior diplomats and foreign government officials. Professor Zhang holds a PhD from China Foreign Affairs University. Again, thank you, Professor Zhang, for being here. It's good to see you. They all only virtually this time, and I really hope that in the post-pandemic zeitgeist, we'll all be able to reunite at Piraeus and theorize live at the source of political science, right? The very term politics comes from Greece, originates in Greece. So let me start with a kind of a question about the bird's eye view, right? The macro strategic trends in China-US relations. So from the moment that Nixon landed in Beijing and changed the world, right, up until today, what are the main sources that have driven the relationship? You know, the structural forces, the domestic political forces. And the reason I'm asking this is because some scholars, not everybody, but some scholars like John Mersheimer comes to mind, have actually said that China and the United States have already entered a new Cold War era. And so I'm wondering, how have we reached that point of intensifying securitization? What are the major drivers? Maybe Professor Nathan could go first.
Okay, thanks. Well, that's a big question. It's kind of two questions. One is about whether we're in a new Cold War, which I think is the wrong word for it. But let me focus on answering your sort of historic question. I think the big drivers are the shift in the power balance between the two countries. When you started out with the time when Nixon visited China, the United States was by far the dominant power in Asia. So that's the sort of inherited position that the United States is seeking to defend, I would say. You know, it's hard to give up power. So the US is not quite ready to give up its inherited position. But China, starting with the Deng Xiaoping period, I guess we could say it started, has undergone this very dramatic rise in power. And as China's power has risen, China has, of course, sought to improve its security position, which has been very poor. So as of the 1970s or 80s or even 90s, China was in a situation where it had a lot of domestic challenges. It had unfriendly neighbors all around it. It had an economy that was very dependent on the global economy without the ability to really influence the global economy, either the rules of it or the military security of it. And so as China became more wealthy, China, of course, tried to improve its security position by building up its military and by building up its economic and diplomatic influence. And that challenged, you might say, the inherited or incumbent position of the United States, and gradually began to cause alarm in the United States about the challenge. And our presidency of Donald Trump has accelerated what was a trend of declining American power. And so this shift in power has caused almost a kind of panic now in the United States. And I hope we'll get to it, but there's a significant consensus in the United States that China represents a threat, but there is also a very significant division of opinion about how great that threat is and what can and should be done about it. So the US is by no means united in its position about US-China relations.
Professor Zhang?
Okay, very, very pleased to have this opportunity and to have discussion and to learn from you. And I agree with Professor Nathan that Cold War is not a good term to refer US-China relations. I think the Chinese do not like this term. And second, I also agree that strategic consideration, a common strategic interest has always been a driver for US-China relations, and which has been, marvelously elaborated by Professor Nathan. I think in addition to strategic consideration, there are other drivers which also played a very important role. And the second, I think, is economic relations, because even in the 1980s, when the Soviet threat declined and the US-China became dependent on each other increasingly on economic terms. So we call the economic relations as the stabilizer of US-China relations. But unfortunately, when Trump became the president, he put forward the American first, policy, and I began to make the stabilizer destabilizer in US-China relations. That's the source of the problem. It used to be a driver, but today became a source of problem. The second thing I think is the driver, or the third driver is, I think it's the domestic politics. I think from 1970, I think China's opening to the outside and reform, and the US support to China reform, it has always been an important driver for the bilateral relation. And the fourth driver for the bilateral relations, I think, is the vision and the leadership from the two sides, from President Nixon and Zhou Enlai and Mao in early 1970s to Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter in later 1970s. I think leaders from both sides have played a very important roles to push the bilateral relations forward. I think if we look back, there are different drivers. I think these four drivers seem to be most important.
Well, let me have a follow-up on that, because what I see here is that you both converge in the idea that structure kind of shapes but does not determine or does not over-determine the relationship. And so I want to focus in particular what happened after the Soviet threat collapsed. So after this strategic imperative of the enemy of my enemy is my friend went away, when I look into the policies and the ideas within the US strategic community, I see kind of two schools. On the one hand, we have those who are saying, oh, we're going to engage with China and do a lot of commerce. And so the trade of goods would lead to a trade of ideas. You would have a new middle class in the Middle Kingdom, and that middle class will kind of become a force, an inexorable force of democratization. And so China is going to become, according to that group of US intellectuals, a liberal democracy in the future. And if it becomes a liberal democracy, democratic peace kicks in. And so democracies rarely fight with each other. But then there's another school of thought in the United States who basically said, no, that was never our strategic end. We never believed that China will become like a liberal democracy on the image of the United States. What we only wanted to do was to engage with an enormous country. It's 1/5 of the world's population, an enormous economy. And so if we want to resolve international problems like financial stability, nuclear non-proliferation, pandemics, obviously, we have to engage with China. So that was a more pragmatic perspective. And so I'm wondering, Professor Nathan and Professor Zhang, when you look within the United States, how strong is ideology and kind of the liberal perspective in driving the relationship after 1991?
I'm sort of curious to hear Professor Zhang answer it first, although, but if you're willing to, how you see the US strategic debate during the engagement period.
So what, I would like to listen to your view first. I think it's
Okay, well, that's
this is
very
the learning
courteous.
process.
Thank you. Yeah. It's a little hard to sort out. So you're talking about the during the engagement period from Nixon up until probably Obama's second term.
I
We
guess
heard a lot of,
after 1991, when the Soviet threat.
Oh, I see. Yes.
So when the enemy of my enemy is my friend imperative went away. Yeah.
Okay. Well, but what I'm about to say really could also apply even farther back, which is that you did hear a lot of, I would say, fancy rhetoric by people who said, China will become a liberal democracy. Probably more among certain academics with the theory that the rise of the middle class, leads to, as you said, to a democracy. But if you really want to talk about strategists, they, almost by definition, are much more realistic in their thinking, as well as rather short-term in their thinking. And I think the strategists who made policy, somebody like, although this is a tiny bit before 1991, but say when George H.W. Bush placed rather mild sanctions on China after Tiananmen, and then went and sent to emissaries to go and speak to Deng Xiaoping and say, look, we understand we still have to have good relations with you. And afterwards, when Clinton, for example, said to China, we're going to cancel your most favored nation trading privileges if you don't improve your human rights situation. And then when they didn't improve their human rights situation, Clinton said, never mind, we're not going to sanction you. That the actual policymakers were always more strategic. But when they went to give their big public speeches to the American people and to explain why are we engaging with, this, communist strange country far away, then they would use rhetoric about democratization and the tides of history and stuff like that. So I think really there was quite a consensus among the actual policy makers on China of what you said as the second thing, is that it's a huge country. We need to be in there with the economy. We need to have China's help to solve various world problems. But there was also a kind of romanticism that China won't challenge us. And I think this is a view of major powers, whether it's the United States or even China itself now, which is, yes, our power is huge, but you don't need to worry about us because we pose no threat to you. It's win-win. China now has a rhetoric of win-win. And this has always been the American rhetoric, although not necessarily the exact same concept, is that, hey, everybody loves us. We're beneficial to you, so don't worry about it. I remember, and this will be the last thing because I know I'm talking too long. I remember when Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense under which president, Vasilis, you remember better than I do, one of the Bushes, I think George H.W., at the Shangri-La conference of high military officials of all of Asia, said to the Chinese defense minister, why are you building up your military? You don't have any enemies. And the Chinese defense minister, I think, didn't exactly answer, but I'm sure Professor Zhang will support me in saying that he must have thought, what are you talking about? You're threatening our security. But Rumsfeld couldn't acknowledge that the American military presence in Asia represented any kind of threat to anybody's security. So the short answer to your question is that strategic thinking was uppermost, and the romance that China would love us and would become a democracy and would implement all of our constitutional practices, that was rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. So excellent. Okay, I think Just now we discussed about the driver of the U.S.-China relations, but I didn't mention ideology or political system, because that has never been the driver for U.S.-China relations. When Nixon came to China, China was still doing the Cultural Revolution, and the domestic situation and the political system is definitely not liked by the United States. But the American decided to open its door to China. In 1979, when U.S.-China relation normalized the diplomatic ties, and China just started to reform. I think ideology is not the driver for U.S. foreign policy. It became the U.S. foreign policy, China policy consideration just after the end of the Cold War. As Professor Nathan discussed about the debate within the U.S. Congress whether to grant China most favored nation status on the condition of human rights, or just to, abolish it, remove that. So from the Chinese perspective, we consider that the better relations was not to change each other, not to remodel each other, but for the mutual interest. If you look at the interest that the two sides has gained from the better relations, we gain a lot. Strategically, the Soviet Union was gone because of the cooperation between China and the United States. And economically, both sides benefited from that. Look at the trade disputes between our two countries. Because of the trade volume is too big. Look at the students exchange. Look at the by two-way investment. So the Chinese would not think that to change China is the goal of the United States. And the U.S. should not based on a policy, a China policy goal to change the Chinese political system. This is the first point. I think that's a response to the liberalist perspective. As for the structural realist perspective, which holds that the U.S. and China we join hands to contain this Soviet Union. That was true. That was the driver when the two countries came together. But today, I think U.S. and China, we share a lot of common ground, like on how to cope with the pandemic and the global climate change and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. All those things need to be cooperated between China. Need to cooperate between China and the United States. Even though the Chinese does not embrace the term G2, but my idea is that if U.S. and China cooperate, we may not be able to solve a lot of problems facing us. But if U.S. and China do not cooperate, I'm sure none of the major issues, global issues, could be settled. Now, from that perspective, I think the Chinese policy toward the United States has not changed. And but the major change is that the American strategic goal in China policy has undergone a lot of change from the 1970s, the 80s, and the 90s. But today, it thinks that U.S. it thought that it has failed in changing China. That has never been their goal when the U.S. decided to improve its relation with China. I think that might be a reflection of the anxieties among the American elites about where China is going and how to deal with China. That does not reflect a change on the Chinese side.
Maybe, Vasilis, can I add something here?
Please.
Sure, great.
So although I said that the Americans did not think that China would become a liberal democracy, but I do think, however, that American strategists did think that China would, quote unquote, change in the sense that it would not view the American presence in Asia as a threat. And that would be having something to do with whether you call it ideology or values that we expected. And I think we may still expect in the long run that the rise of a huge middle class in China and as well as international pressure that the United States may be able to bring to bear would cause China to be more accepting of what the US thinks of as individual freedom and rule of law kinds of things. So, I mean, we're getting into some areas that are complicated and where big words like liberal democracy might cause us to have some confusion. But I don't want to be misunderstood as saying that there was no values component in American policy. I think there was. I could say more about that, if you wish, or when we speak about what we think future US policy is going to be, I could say more, but I just want to say it's partly, as Professor Zhang says, cooperation for mutual economic gain and other things, but we absolutely did expect student exchanges, the introduction of China into international institutions that are governed by treaties and so forth, and all that would create easier cooperation between the two sides. And that hasn't really happened for reasons that are partly strategic and, as Professor Zhang indicated, partly political.
Yeah.
Well, let me bring in the issue of fear and anxiety that you both mentioned, and also invite the spirit of Thucydides, this great ancient Greek scholar, because he sourced the causes of war in basically three major factors: interest, a clash of interest, a competition, antagonism for honor and prestige, and third, because of fear. And you mentioned fear and anxiety. And I want to focus here on technology, because I remember when I went to China in 2012, kind of the consensus within even the Chinese academy was that China cannot innovate disruptively. And even Chinese scholars used to say that the Chinese techno-industrial system was very inefficient, that after the great reforms of Premier Zhu Rongji, the SOE reform has stalled and China cannot innovate. And also from the US side, I remember a lot of journal articles, Harvard Business Review or the International Security Journal, why China cannot innovate and China will never catch up with the United States. However, fast forward from 2012 to 2016, and we see China strategically leapfrogging the United States when it comes to 5G networks, a highly contentious issue, and even Germany when it comes to the internal combustion engine. China now is the leader of electric vehicles. And so that has created a lot of fear in the United States and even in the European Union that suddenly the Chinese behemoth is becoming extremely competitive on technological level. And so I'm wondering how this fear about the success of the techno-industrial system in China is playing into the bilateral competition here. So Professor Zhang, Professor Nathan, anybody?
I think I'll follow Professor Nathan, a professor of mine, whom I respect a lot.
Professor Nathan, please.
Oh, well, I think there's a lot at stake in technological predominance in any field. So 5G is a great example. First of all, whoever has the advanced technology in 5G is going to set the standards, and then everybody else has to comply if they're going to be in the market. Secondly, the leader is going to make a huge amount of money globally. That economy will lead. Third, and in the case of cyber techniques, I think we've learned that you can't trust anybody, that espionage is a reality that will never stop. And so whoever has the most advanced technology has the most advanced espionage. So there's very good reason for anybody to be in fear on the question of technological supremacy. If the Chinese are setting the standards, we will be afraid. If we're setting the standards, the Chinese will be afraid. If either the US or China is setting the standards, the Europeans will have to be afraid, I guess, of whoever it is, unless, and if it's Germany, then the Greeks will be afraid. There's no way around it. And so it is extremely important, especially 5G and other cyber technology. But when you come to say electric vehicles, solar power and stuff like that, there's a huge amount of money involved, whoever is in the lead. So that is well-founded. And the question of whether China can in fact, sees the lead is one that's being constantly debated in the United States, as you know, Vasilis, that there are still, although there's quite a bit of pessimism about it, there are still some scholars who say, and this is a field I don't understand too well, right, the high tech, but for example, the University of California at San Diego just issued a report that I'm sure you've seen about the technological competition. And that report is one that says, no, the United States still commands the advantages in technological innovation, including among our advantages, the openness of our educational system to students from China and from India and elsewhere. So I think one of the policies that the Biden administration is going to take, if the Senate will allow it to do so, is to increase federal investment in research and development, which is something that the Trump administration has reduced, and that the United States wants to, stay, not give up, but stay in that technological competition in the key technologies of the 21st century.
Okay, great. I think, first of all, high-tech competition between powers today become very important. In the past, it's basically a military competition or competition GDP, but today, high-tech competition become not only a front of competition, but it will also affect other fields. That's the reason why countries pay a lot of attention to high-tech. This is the first thing. Secondly, I also agree that there is a long way for China to catch up with the United States and with Europe, West Europe, in many important areas of high tech. So, for policy makers, cannot make policy according to a certain kind of emotion or fear or anxiety. That will be counterproductive. The policy should be made on the basis of solid evidence to find out what the situation is. So I think the accusation of the Chinese espionage and stuff, and especially what the Trump administration has been doing to restrict the Chinese students to study from studying in the United States, will not only undermine the Chinese technology innovation, but also undermine the U.S. technology, innovation technology, because a lot of the American advantage in this regard is that they make use of, the best, the brightest around the globe, including the Chinese. So I've noticed that this year, there are the students who got a visa to study in the United States decreased by 99%. So this will undermine the Chinese, and it will also, is detrimental for the United States. And lastly, I think the Chinese is always puzzled. The Chinese has always been, always heard that the U.S. government said that they welcome a prosperous China, strong China, to play a very constructive role on the global stage. But when it comes to the high tech, we found that the policy the U.S. is pursuing, does not conform to what it said, as it says. So in this regard, it is also undermine the Chinese trust and increase the Chinese suspicion of the United States. That is not good for the better relations.
Let me jump in here for a bit. I think this discussion has gone very well because we did a little bit about the past. We're now reaching the present. And I'm about to ask you to take out your crystal balls. And no one can predict the future, but let's see some trends. And also there are a couple of things that I'd like to understand a little bit more. So let's turn first to Europe. The way I see it is that with little doubt, for better or worse, there's increased US-Chinese competition, especially in the field of the high tech, as you just very correctly pointed out. And Europe is somewhere in between. To me, it seems that Europe has basically three choices. One is the European Union united to side with the United States against China. A second choice would be for the European Union to side with either the US or China based on specific issues. The third strategy, which would probably be the best from a Chinese perspective, is each state decides what its best interests are and goes it alone, except that now you're dealing with a far more powerful country. So when you look at what the European Union countries and European countries in general, because, for example, the United Kingdom is now exiting, how do you think they should view and act towards increased Chinese-American competition, especially, but not exclusively, on the high-tech sector? Either one can go first.
Okay, let me start it. First for this one, I think it has been China's policy to support the unity of Europe, so that it can play a very active and independent voice, play an independent role on global stage. There has been a long policy. So the Chinese government want to develop, my understanding that to develop a good relation with Europe on the basis of what the Chinese always emphasize about the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. But unfortunately, we have seen that during the Trump administration, the U.S. government has done a lot to persuade, even to force some of the EU members to not to use the Chinese 5G. And they try to exclude the Chinese, their high-tech cooperation with China. So I think the EU, to some extent, has been affected by American such a policy. So for the Chinese, we expect, I think the government expected that the bilateral relations should not be affected by the third, the outsider. So it will be very good for EU to decide its China policy or to decide its position between China and United States according to specific issues, so that to make its decision, on the case-by-case basis, rather than to follow the United States. Of course, the China does not persuade the EU to say, okay, follow us, to stay away from the United States. Even the United States today pursue a unilateral policy. And China and EU, we share a lot of common ground, like we both propose for multilateralism. So, but China did not, has not tried, it's not China's policy to persuade, to drag the EU to the Chinese side in confrontation with the United States.
So on something like 5G, I think most of the European countries started out looking at cost and availability, that Huawei was available and the American alternative hadn't been developed yet, and the Huawei was very good price. But then I think that American lobbying of Europe was not just was really not the exercise of brute force, but rather persuaded the Europeans that Huawei really was tied up with the Chinese government and represented an espionage risk. And as I said before, you can't trust anybody in international affairs. So of course, there's an espionage risk if you have American equipment, or even if you don't, because the Americans can also, tap into somebody else's equipment. So it's kind of a question of who do you want to be spied on more? And this then gets into the values issue. And I think that the Europeans in general nobody trusts the United States very much after 4 years of Trump. And Biden will have a hard time restoring trust. But I still think at this point, the Europeans see that they have more in common with the values that American diplomacy promotes, the so-called rule of law, the so-called equal playing field for economic competition and things like that. So I think that Europeans have to make their decisions on the basis of sort of who do you distrust the least, as it were. And so here I would say that Chinese diplomacy in Europe has done some damage to Chinese interests because of the so-called wolf diplomacy, that the Europeans have perceived China as pushing the Europeans around too much in ways that the Europeans don't appreciate. Of course, again, the United States is by no means innocent of this. Any great power will push others around, but it does seem to me, as a matter of sort of objective reporting, that China has damaged its own case in Europe by some of the behavior of some of its diplomats.
Just very quickly, Aristotle, just a follow-up here, because I really think the Huawei issue, it's not the strategic litmus test for Europe, for the very simple reason that Europe has two companies like Nokia and Ericsson. And I think it makes sense from a European perspective to support Nokia and Ericsson. So on that issue of 5G, although I do agree with Professor Nathan that values matter, I don't think that's a litmus test for the decisions that Europe will be making in the future and choosing issues between China and the United States.
But make no doubt, Europe will be making decisions about this, and one way or another. And let me switch to Russia. During the Cold War, there was little doubt that China was the junior partner to the Soviet Union. Now, the way things are going, it looks more likely that Russia might become a junior partner to an ascendant China. From an international relations theoretical point of view, what Russia does in the coming years and decades is fascinating, because in theory, we teach our students, when you have a rising power, a power that's not as powerful has basically two choices: bandwagon, join forces that is, or balance. And as long as Putin is there, it's really bandwagoning, but Putin's not going to be around forever. So again, crystal ball comes out. How do you view, what are the trends between Chinese and Russian relations, given asymmetries in population and really economic growth and sophistication of the economy? Professor Nathan, you go first, please.
Okay. Well, in this case, I think Chinese diplomacy has been brilliant. I admire it because the Russians face serious security threats on both sides, right, to the east and to the west. In the long historical perspective, the Russians have been very suspicious of China. It's so huge. It's, and so, but the Chinese have treated Russia very, very well. As China's influence has extended into Central Asia, they've been careful to coordinate that with Russia, to let Russia feel that China respects Russia's interests in Central Asia and so on. China respects Russia's interest in every aspect, although they bargain hard on the price of oil and things of that kind. So that allows Putin and probably Putin's successor to view the primary threat to Russia's security interests is coming from the United States and its allies in Europe. So I think that in my crystal ball, as long as China continues to be so intelligently sensitive to Russian security interests, Russia will continue to cooperate with China in order to pay its attention to the American threat.
Just very quickly, just to stimulate Professor Zhang's response on Russia, I remember back in 2014, there was a significant debate within China about abandoning Deng Xiaoping's principle of non-alliances and signing a security treaty with Russia. And I guess Tsinghua was the leading school when it comes to that debate, my good friend, Professor Yan Shuitong. But then the leadership in China said, no, we're not going to have an official treaty alliance with Russia. We're just going to establish this all-weather comprehensive partnership on triple steroids. So could you talk a little bit about the debate within China on China-Russian relations and the security perspective?
Okay, thank you. First, I think just now you mentioned the role of ideology and value. and in China, Europe, and Europe, America, the trilateral relations. Giving me the impression, I think that the value or the differences in political system seems to come back in international relations, which was not so important in the past. The example is between China and Russia. China and Russia, we have different political system, different cultural, different history, and we have also have a very unpleasant history during the late Qing dynasty. But China and Russia could cooperate mainly because the two sides share a lot of common ground on global issues, like both support multilateralism, both share the same kind of position on North Korean nuclear issue, Iran issue. I think it's the common interest and now the value that is playing its role in China-Russian relations. So the question about the China's alliance, I think yes, that was a hot debate in 2013, 14, and 15. But I think the debate has stopped. Basically, the Chinese government will not abandon its non-aligned foreign policy. There's two reasons, I think. The first reason is that China, the PRC entered military alliances with Russia in 1950, and it lasted only for 10 years. Even though it was declared the end, expired in 1979, but it ended in 1960 when China-Russia relations deteriorated. China learned a lesson from that. That is, if you form an alliance with any country, you cannot decide your own policy because you have to consult your allies when you make your foreign policy. And you also have to, shoulder some responsibilities for the policy decision of your allies. So from that, China said that is against the Chinese independent foreign policy. So from 1979, China made it very, very clear that China will not form alliance with any country. So at the beginning of this century, I think in 2013, 14, and 15, professors led by the scholars led by Professor Yan Xietung in Tsinghua University, they proposed for China to give up its non-aligned foreign policy and try to form alliances with Russia or with Korea, with Pakistan and those countries. But that is not the mainstream view, and that view has been, declined by the government because the Chinese government today still consider alignment as a kind of Cold War mentality, and China proposed a new comprehensive new concept of security, that is security not based on alliances but based on mutual security, not by forming alliances against the other, because the Cold War idea of security is my security is based on I try to seek absolute security, but then my absolute security is based on the absolute insecurity of the other side. And that you can't fall, by that means you cannot reach security. So the Chinese pursue a mutual security. A mutual security is basically to give up alignment arrangement. So the Chinese has also been very critical about what the US has been proud of, that is the hub and spoke alignment. I think this will now change from my perspective.
I have to say that this is very fascinating, and it ties up with something that you both said, you both agreed, and so do I, that just talking about a new Cold War is ultimately misleading. But boy, things are getting chilly. That much we can say. And if we look at issues of contention, we mentioned high technology. That's one. If we look at the world, would you say if the Cold War was about Central Europe, the South China Sea now becomes more important? If you had a certain group of alliances back then, now you're having different kinds of, not alliances, understandings or cooperations. In what ways in this chillier environment is the world changing between, I still wouldn't say the US bloc and the Chinese bloc, but between China and the US? And just to make things a little bit more harder, we started by, I think Vasily started by citing John Mearsheimer. And I'll have another quote from him. Again, this is the ultimate crystal ball. He says, I'm slightly more pessimistic. Coming from him, believe me, that means a lot. So, because he's like the ultimate pessimist. I'm slightly more pessimistic now about the possibility of an actual war between the US and China. So he's taking it to another level, but he's doing it publicly. So can we at least try and tie up these things and see what is going on? What is the worst case scenario, and what is the area in the world that is more troubling to you if something bad is to happen? Because it's not Central Europe anymore. That much is certain. Professor Zhang, might you want to take a crack at it first?
Let me say it this way. I think we think that Cold War is misleading because the relationship between China and the United States today is very different from that between US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Look at how dependent the two sides in economic area. Look at the trade volume. Look at how the social inter-societal relations. How many Chinese are studying in the United States? How many people, exchange visits between China and the United States? And thirdly, think about the high tech today. Think about the, even if it's the Cold War, during the Cold War, there has never been a case the United States and Soviet Union engage in direct confrontation, a war of confrontation. So I think look at the situation in China-US relation today. We have a lot to worry, but I do not think there is a likelihood the two sides will, and I hope there will be no likelihood that the two sides engage in a direct confrontation between China and the United States. But that does not mean we should not worry about it. We do need to worry about it. Look at the South China Sea. Look at the relationship between the United States and the Taiwan, which the US recognized as a part of China. So we have noticed that just yesterday, the American Major General visited Taiwan for the first time after normalization of US-China relation in 1979. All those send out worrisome signals for the better relations. So I think after Biden takes office next year, the two sides needed to activate and reopen all the channel of dialogue between China and the United States, and to try to find out in which area the two sides could cooperate, in which area the two sides could have a dialogue, and in which area we find a crisis that two sides need to manage. So that is very, very important. I think the only role of Mearsheimer to talk about the pessimistic future of US-China relations is that it reminds people, reminds the leaders, we have to be very careful. There's a danger of a war between the two countries. If the two leaders do not manage, do not have a vision, do not have the leadership, they do not manage those crises or the possible in the hot spots, and the two sides may get into war. I think in the end, it will be, if Mearsheimer is wrong, that it will be his contribution. if he's correct, I think that would be not his contribution. So I met him in a conference, I read that. So he reminds people that his contribution. I think we have to worry about it, but that is, we have to manage the hotspots, to our better relations, but we need to try our best to avoid a clash to break out between our two countries.
So let's hope he makes a negative contribution. Professor Nathan, you're next, and Vasily, if you want to chime in on this, please do as well.
Yeah, well, in the Cold War, there are many differences. I agree with what Professor Zhang said, the interdependence of the two powers now, which was not the case during the Cold War, as well as the pressing nature of global problems like pandemics and climate change, which require cooperation. But I would like to focus on the sort of strategic differences. So in the Cold War, the Soviet Union had an ambition to spread its system of government all around the world. China doesn't seem to have that ambition. It respects every country's own system of government and just wants those countries to respect Chinese interests. And as you pointed out, the military confrontation was on land in Europe, and a land war by nature is very protracted and extremely costly. In the US-China case, the military confrontation is centered on Taiwan, actually. And I think although the South China Sea is important for lots of reasons, including the sea lanes of communication and transportation and fisheries and so forth and so on, I think the strategic importance of the South China Sea is about Taiwan. It's that naval and air dominance in the South China Sea would be one of the key elements for the battle over Taiwan, for the United States to defend Taiwan or for China to take Taiwan militarily. So I would focus on the Taiwan issue. And I think Mearsheimer focuses on that issue as well. And I think that is a dangerous strategic confrontation, but it wouldn't easily escalate into a world war because it's a local confrontation, and it's predominantly a maritime confrontation. Now, what is the risk of a war over Taiwan? I think that Chinese strategy is not to launch a war over Taiwan, but to win Taiwan through political and economic means. That is to say, to cut down Taiwan's diplomatic ties, to change the military balance between China and the United States so that the American deterrence of military force over Taiwan is reduced, and then the Taiwanese understand that, and then they lose faith in the American protection and negotiate an end to the so-called Taiwan issue. So I think China's strategy is a long-term peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue strategy, which depends upon gradually changing the military balance with the United States. That means China will not launch an attack on Taiwan in the near future. They're going to wait and hope that the United States security guarantee will diminish. But as the two sides are trying to adjust the balance between each other militarily, the South China Sea emerges as very important. And China has gradually and steadily increased its naval deployments and built these sand islands and so on in the South China Sea. And the United States so far has responded to that by somewhat increasing its naval patrols in the South China Sea. So I think there is a very real risk of an accidental clash, which probably would not escalate into a full-scale war in the foreseeable future. So that's my take on the risks that we face, and also why it is dangerous, but it is less dangerous than the Soviet-American confrontation in Europe in the 1950s and 60s.
Well, just very quickly, talking about strategic miscalculations in Taiwan, I'm wondering what Professor Nathan's view is about strategic ambiguity. Do you think that kind of doctrine works for the next 5-10 years? Should the United States revise it? Should it give a clear signal of strategic commitment instead of being ambiguous about Taiwan?
Yeah, so Vasilis is asking this question because there's been a debate recently in the United States about some people saying it's as China increases its military threat to Taiwan, the United States should abandon strategic ambiguity and should adopt strategic clarity. Strategic ambiguity was that the United States said we have an interest in the peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue, but it did not say we will absolutely, what will we do in case China uses military force against Taiwan. And then some people said, now we have to say that we will absolutely commit ourselves to intervening. My personal view is I see no benefit in announcing strategic clarity. It will cause a crisis in US-China relations. It will cause Beijing to increase its military and diplomatic and economic pressure on Taiwan, but it won't change the military balance. The real issue is the military balance between China and the United States. As China has built up its what the Pentagon calls A2AD, anti-access area denial capability. See, the US military posture in the Western Pacific is based on aircraft carriers and big air bases in Guam and in Japan. And China has, of course, noticed that and has built up missile submarines, cyber jamming capabilities that are precisely designed to prevent the aircraft carriers from getting into the Taiwan battle space, the so-called anti-area denial and anti-access. And so the US is, if it's going to, and also the US Navy is very strained in its global deployments. And so if the US is going to have a credible deterrent against the Chinese invasion of Taiwan, it has to change its military posture in the region to respond to the Chinese measures that have been taken. And that's what counts. It doesn't count about whether you say, I'm absolutely going to do X, Y, Z, but whether you have the capability to do so.
Professor Zhang, do you want to add something perhaps?
Not working. Okay, it works now. So that strategy of ambiguity has worked very well since 1979. So to change, I noticed that there's a debate, but the government policy has not to make it, still keep this ambiguous position. I think it has served the two sides, and if there is a change, then it will be very risky, and it will put great pressure on the Chinese side, and for the Chinese government to increase its military buildup and to take more active, proactive measures. Take measures on the cross-strait relations. It will further accelerate the relations and increase the risk. It will be very, very dangerous. I think it would be very, very wise for the United States not to change it.
So as we move forward, I have one question, and then I will ask Vasily to actually handle the Q&A because we've been getting some very, a number of questions here. So I gave you a crystal ball. Now I'm going to give you a magic wand, and I'm going to ask both of you, we are where we are right now. If you could change some things magically in the Chinese-American relationship, what would that be? And also, because this is a predominantly Greek audience, Greece's decision makers, students, people in the military, diplomats, they are all watching right now. We know that from their email addresses. The question, Greece is a smaller country, but an ancient nation. And the question in Greece is, we see relations between China and the US, let's say, not improving. A wise friend of mine predicted that Donald Trump will be the most pro-China president compared to all his successors. We'll see. But what should Greece be doing? How should Greece be traversing these increasingly perilous international waters? So magic wand, what should Greece do? Vasily, you do the Q&A, and that will be the end of our fascinating webinar. Thank you. Professor Zhang, do you want to go first with your magic wand?
I think, it just seems to be so clear from the Chinese side, able that two countries could, stick to, the principles enshrined in the three communiques, which laid the foundation for bilateral relations, everything will be good. And the principles enshrined in the three communiques is broken, then the basic foundation of U.S.-China relations will be gone. And at the very core of the three communiques is the Taiwan issue. If the U.S. changes Taiwan policy and make it very clear, and then that relationship will be dangerous. So what the Chinese, I noticed that the Chinese government, from the foreign minister and the Chinese officials, have made it very, very clear. We want to have a good relation with the United States. We do not want to challenge the US leading role. We do not want to drive the United States out of the Pacific Ocean. We want to make it very, very clear. We want to have a great relation with the United States. But as we always say, it takes two to tango. And especially at this moment, we see that the relationship deteriorate mainly because the Americans are taking the initiative, and the Chinese has been very, very passive, even though it wants to have good relations, but it is difficult. So, it will be a lot of expectation for the US to take some measures to put the better relations back to the normal. That would be the earlier track. That would be great, but it seems to be very, very difficult, I think. And secondly, I think usually in China, we always think about, for third country, we talk about Japan, talk about South Korea, the ASEAN, and India, what they should do, because it is very, very difficult, very important for them to have a very good China-US relations. But I think it is fortunate for you, Grace. You are far from, Asia. You are far from Europe. Seems to be. You have a lot of choice. What the Chinese expect is that, try to, build our bilateral relations on bilateral cases rather than, affected and follow one side or the other, and to make a choice. And that'll be very difficult. In the end, I think it will be detrimental. It will not be a very smart diplomatic means to choose a side.
Thank you, Professor Nathan.
So I probably don't need a magic wand, because I think the things that I want to have happen the Biden administration will pursue. And that's walking on two legs. One is to reopen communication with China on issues where cooperation is possible. But the other one is that I think the strategic competition objectively exists. So when Professor Zhang says, can we go back to the good old days? It really is a new situation, because China is a much more powerful country than it has been in the past. And the United States needs to stay in that strategic competition, which involves diplomacy. We're not going to change China by force or by persuasion. We have to rebuild our alliances and get back into the multilateral institutions that the Trump administration left, and be in the competition. Competitions last for a long, long time. They're not something with a magic wand to solve them, but the magic wand is get back in the competition and play the game, and play it as peacefully as much as possible. But it certainly involves maintaining a military balance as well around Taiwan. We haven't really discussed why Taiwan is an American strategic interest, but I'll just say that I think that it is. And so we have to do the military things that enable us to continue to deter a coercive unification of Taiwan with mainland China. So that's the magic wand. As for Greece, at the high level of abstraction, I agree with Professor Zhang, is that Greece has its own interests. It should maintain its own independence. It should go along with, chiefly with, as far as foreign relations are concerned, primarily with its colleagues in the European Union. That's the main thing for Greece to think about. And its relationship with China is predominantly economic. And I think that's fine as long as China doesn't use that economic leverage to try to control or influence Greek diplomacy or Greek public opinion. And the same thing with the United States. If the United States misuses its power to try to push Greece around, Greece should resist that. It should really join up with the other EU powers to try to be a third or additional unified pole of international influence. I think that for the Europeans, the rules of international commerce, the sort of rule of law values that the United States keeps talking about, are the most important international interests. The European Union is not going to be a global military power, so it needs to be a global normative and economic power.
Well, this is a fascinating discussion. Let me just very quickly follow up on the issue about alliances and how small countries could respond in this intensifying bipolar securitization. So in terms of values, Joe Biden has announced that he will call this summit of democracies. And I'm wondering, how will that play out? I mean, is he going to invite, let's say, Poland or Hungary or Singapore? Or Vietnam, right? In the sense that if the United States has this goal to build a coalition of values, where do you put the threshold? And so how is this going to play out strategically from a kind of new Biden administration?
And Vasily, just to add, you're also going to do the Q&A. So it's up to you to decide which
Sure.
questions you want to be asked. The floor is also all yours for that as well.
Well, I can be brief on that one. I don't know. It's a great question, but that'll be for the diplomats who are really dealing with the details. I don't know, and I'm not sure how that Conference of Democracies is going to serve American diplomatic interests exactly either.
I agree that value is not the only determinants of foreign policy and diplomacy. I think every country will have its own judgment, whether to join the U.S. alliance or not. Because like Singapore, I'm not clear about other countries, but I think that Singapore has made it very, very clear they will not, choose a side. They want to make good relations, have good relations with both sides. That is their own interest. So that will be a very, very, ambitious to build, alliance of democracy. But I think it will be very, very difficult.
Yeah, I think I remember the Singaporean prime minister who has time and over again stressed the fact that he wouldn't like to have the United States or China asking him to choose sides. And I think that's the average position in ASEAN as well. And even Vietnam, who has quite intense relations with China, has kind of pushed back the United States a little bit, and it hasn't abandoned its four nose policies. So even countries which are very close to China and have kind of fear of this behemoth next door, time and again have said that we don't want to choose. So I guess that's going to be a very difficult strategic kind of perspective for the United States on how to attract security allies. All right. And so I see a question here about the China threat in the United States, and I guess also perhaps the American threat in China. So do you think there's an inflation here? Do you think politicians, let's say in the United States, have used the COVID pandemic to inflate the China threat? Is there kind of the Trump administration approach to mobilize the society and win politically from inflating the China threat?
Yes, absolutely. That's true. So the Trump administration has got several factions within it with respect to China, but this questioner is pointing to a strong faction in the Trump administration, which especially is led by Mike Pompeo, who has built up this image of a China. It's not very clear exactly what the threat is, but it is portrayed as a kind of foreign threat to American civilization. It's almost a kind of racist claim that this alien civilization is not white, it's not Christian, it has a whole different vision. It's an existential threat to the West and so forth and so on. And that is obviously, that's not strategic thinking. It is domestic political appeal to the Trump base. Trump himself wavers back and forth. I love the Chinese, they buy my apartments and so forth and so on. But he has let this China threat group in the administration kind of run away with his policy in the last year or so.
And I agree. I think it's very interesting, during the Cold War in the 60s and the 70s, when both from China, we try to say we are great. The other side, the other, the political system is so weak, they're going to collapse. And the Chinese said that we would go to US to liberate Americans, even though China was so weak. But today, both countries are so strong, so powerful, they began to be afraid of the other side. I think for the US, I think it's basically for domestic consumption, because on the one hand, we hear the American government says that it's very, very proud of the political system, is the leader, does not want to see any country to challenge the US leading role. That shows America is very powerful, very confident. But at the same time, it seems, that China is threatening the United States. I think that is just one, you can understand it as a domestic strategy, and to divert, a problem, a domestic problem. Secondly, I think that might, indicate the less confidence of the United States. From the Chinese side, I think the threat, in the past has been very, big, because America seems to be a threat to the Chinese territorial integrity and sovereignty. But today, China does not think that way. Perhaps it's a threat not to their sovereignty and territorial integrity, might be a threat to the political system, to the rule of the CCP. I think this kind of perceptual threat is asymmetric for different reasons. This is my understanding.
Okay, so talking about asymmetry, there's a question about China in Africa, and I would like to put that into the wider strategic perspective of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Pompeo and Trump ran a global campaign trying to frame the BRI as a debt trap, and also they put some money on the table, American money on the table, like the Blue Dot Network in ASEAN, and so I'm wondering, what are the views within the Biden administration about the BRI, and is there a way for the United States to be more competitive and less combative on global finance and development?
Well, that's a complicated one. I don't know what the views in detail within the Biden administration on the BRI are. I think what I do know is that we see the BRI as a huge amount of money, allegedly $1 trillion in loans that have very, very mixed impacts around the world. So in some countries, the projects are commercially viable and really help the development of that country. In some other countries, the projects get mired down in corruption and environmental pollution and so forth. And in every country where the BRI exists, there's always a pro-BRI faction and an anti-faction. So for example, the government takes the loan and the opposition criticizes the loan and so forth. So the BRI is not one single thing. It's very, very mixed. But it does serve in general to expand the Chinese presence around the world and to expand Chinese diplomatic influence around the world. And the United States doesn't have the money to invest to match it. So the American answer is to say, we'll do higher quality products. We'll do investments that are more commercially viable. Ours involve private enterprise money and stuff like that. And I actually think in the end of the day, money is money, and that the BRI is going to be quite successful and difficult for the United States to match.
I think for BRI, and it is the main purpose of the Chinese government emphasizes about connectivity, especially focus on infrastructure. The Chinese has money, as Professor Nathan said, China has money, so China invest. And those kind of investment will definitely increase China's influence in those areas. But the influence comes from, the local people benefit from the Chinese investment. Otherwise, they would not like it. So this is, I think, mutual, from the Chinese perspective, mutual beneficial. And the Chinese President Xi Jinping says it is public good the Chinese government provides to other countries. But this is and the Chinese government is not, the BRI is not exclusive. I think it might be a very good platform for other countries, including the United States, to have the third-party cooperation in those areas. So, but I also have not seen any people discuss about the Biden administration's possible policy on BRI. There are a lot of discussions about what Biden would do, what are the areas the two sides could cooperate, and what are the areas that the two sides will compete. But I have not noticed anybody talk about the BRI. It will be very interesting to know after the Biden administration takes office.
I think if I recall correctly, when the Obama administration made the decision not to join the AAIB, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, there was a lot of criticism coming from within the Democratic Party. And I think Susan Rice wanted to join, but then overall, Obama made the decision not to join. And so that would be interesting how, Biden will kind of play out developmental institutions. If there is a way for the United States to join the AIB, that would be an amazing signal for the bilateral relationship, given that, every single European I've heard about the AIB says that that's a truly international global institution, and it does not really operate based on Chinese principles, but rather kind of a multipolar structure. And so I see here another question about trade policy. And so obviously Trump was a trade unilateralist. He shattered international trade regime. What is the expectation of the TPP, Biden's approach in trade policy in Asia? Is he going to be more multilateral and try to go back into the Obama structure of commerce?
So Biden has a certain amount of political capital to spend. It looks like the Republicans are going to adopt a kind of burn all, kill all policy toward Biden as they did toward Obama and criticize absolutely everything that he does. Trump is not going to disappear. Pompeo is not going to disappear. So the strategic common sense is for the United States to rejoin the TPP, to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal, to rejoin the Paris Climate Treaty, to rejoin the World Health Organization, and so forth and so on. Each of these steps, Biden will be spending some political capital, will be attacked by the Republicans. So it's really not clear which of these things he's going to do. I think we could safely say in broad terms that his trade policy will be more multilateral. It won't be the America first and the tariffs. But for example, will he remove the tariffs that Trump placed on Chinese goods? If he ought to do so, because they're costing American taxpayers, but if he does it, he'll be attacked. So I cannot predict with any kind of accuracy which costly steps Biden will choose to take and which of them he will choose to put on the back burner because he has something more important to do, especially in domestic politics in terms of reviving the economy, dealing with the pandemic and stuff like that.
I think it'd be very difficult to, to speculate what he's going to do. There are people here in China and talk about that Biden might not remove the tariffs that Trump has, levied on Chinese export to the United States. And there is also discussions about TPP and the likelihood that Biden might, come back to restart the TPP negotiation. But the problem is that whether that will invite China or not. I think the Chinese is concerned that this might be to build another bloc, try to hinder China rather than to socialize China. So I do not know exactly what the Biden administration will do with the trade.
And now,
Let me
just
interject at this point if I can. I think we're running out of time. So
very quickly, Aristotle, just very quickly, is a very important question, more aspirational tone. I would say, going back to people's exchanges and your advice about those future leaders that they're going to shape the relationship. Now, teaching at Schwarzman, I see my American and Chinese students as enlightened children of globalization. So when I mark their essays, if I hide their name, I cannot tell who is the American and who is the Chinese student. they converge when it comes to global issues. They are very patriotic when it comes to domestic issues, but their mindset converges when it comes to global issues. And so I'm wondering if there is a viable policy here to supercharge that dimension of a China-US relationship. And you are great educators. You have seen those youth, the millennials. What would you advise to them?
Well, I think first of all, there should be no, barriers established to prevent people-to-people exchange, especially for the young people to study in the other side. There are more than 360, thousands of Chinese students studying in the United States. I think they are not just only studying the technology, they are also studying to get to know the United States culturally, and they begin to be exposed to the American values. And then they come back to become the very important strands of bilateral relations. So I think because of Trump's policy, try to limit immigration, and especially because of the pandemic this year, the Chinese students who go to the United States is reduced remarkably by 99%. In the past, every year this time I wrote recommendation letters for my Chinese students who apply to the best universities in the United States, including Columbia. But this year, so far, I have not written one letter for Chinese students, even though I wrote several letters for students, but they are from Europe, from other countries. I think this is a very detrimental for the future U.S.-China relations. As a professor, I think this is really bad. I think both sides need to open their door widely. No matter how bad they are, strategic or political relations, it is in the long run, it's a benefit to the two sides to increase the people-to-people exchange.
I agree entirely, and I think from a strictly American strategic interest point of view, there's more involved, as both of you have said, but just from the narrowest selfish point of view, the opportunity to educate hundreds of thousands of Chinese students in the United States has been a tremendous strategic advantage to the United States and has increased understanding between the two sides and increased American influence in China, and has done a lot to bring China up, to educate Chinese lawyers and Chinese international practitioners and so forth in a way that has made it much, much easier to manage the relationship. There are, however, a small percentage of Chinese students who actually are engaged in technical or strategic espionage, and we have to be careful about that small percentage.
I have to be a little bit contrary here. I think this was a missed opportunity. Confucius institutes are folding down. Many examples of espionage or a whole ministry in China dealing with these students, keeping tabs on them. This has to be reformed on both sides. And I think now is the opportunity to do it. And on this hopeful point, I have to thank some people by concluding on time, exactly on time. First of all, Professors Nathan and Zhang for their Olympian intellects and the fact that they shed light on a very complex, complicated, and significant relationship, probably the most important bilateral relationship in the 21st century. Vasilis Trigas, who is a star and who helped organize this. My colleagues at the Council for International Relations Greece and at the Department of International and European Studies at the University of Piraeus, we have been very supportive. Special shout out to Professor Athanasios Platias, my mentor, who has been extremely supportive and chair of the department. And the people, the students and professionals, we had 100 and so on the Zoom session, and we have about 1,000, or we will have 1,000 on our YouTube channel. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. This has been informative. This has been fascinating, and I promised this was going to be fun. So thank you very much, and hopefully we'll meet again sometime in the near future. And Dean Svakianakis, thank you as well for always being supportive of us and our efforts again.
Oh, thank you for this opportunity. See you, Professor Nathan. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much also.
Okay, great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.